America is often compared to ancient Rome and its influence on the world. In my opinion, as a descendant of Greco-Roman culture, this comparison is unfounded. But today we will not discuss whether America is a contemporary of ancient Rome. Today we will discuss how history might have unfolded if the Romans had discovered and then colonized America. How could such a strange and unlikely alternative story begin? Very simply, the discovery of America would have happened accidentally and unintentionally, rather than with the intention of finding a new route to Asia, as the Europeans did. The best Roman ships, indirectly based on Carthaginian vessels, relied on older Phoenician ships that explored vast distances 1,000 years before Rome and Carthage, showcasing the immense efficiency and technological advancements of these fleets. From a technological standpoint, the Romans had a fleet capable of handling the challenges of crossing a vast sea like the Atlantic, although the possibility that several sailors could survive for months until they reach America is not entirely clear. But for the purposes of this scenario, let's assume that Roman sailors will survive this hostile and extreme journey. So how could circumstances lead to the accidental discovery of the New World 1,500 years earlier than in our history? In fact, the Romans, contrary to popular belief, were quite capable of becoming great explorers of distant lands. They had the opportunity and human curiosity to explore the most distant lands far from their empire, which was not a unique trait of the Greeks and their explorers who existed centuries before the Roman occupation. It is important to remember that in my videos, when I create a map of the Roman Empire adapted to an alternative scenario, my maps are mainly functional and not intended to detail all aspects of governance and the true extent of the Roman Empire's influence, as that would take too much time. That's why sometimes, to distract myself while editing my videos, I play a time-lapse video about the historical evolution of the Roman Empire in the background, illustrated with a very detailed and carefully crafted map. The last of such videos that truly impressed me with its level of detail and craftsmanship belongs to user K. Pard and his most recent video about the history of Roman civilization. If I speak of his work in the latest video, it is because it features perhaps the most detailed time-lapse video of the history of Rome that has ever existed on YouTube, and possibly on the internet as a whole. The video even includes images of such insignificant places as Roman outposts, one of which is the famous Roman outpost Mogador, known today as the city of Essaouira on the coast of Morocco. And if I mention the Roman outpost, you probably already guessed that this outpost was usually used for a deeper exploration of the West African coast beyond the Mediterranean Sea. Roman representatives used it for trade and research with the peoples now known as the Canary Islands of modern Spain. The Mogador outpost was under Roman control or influence, at least since the time of Augustus. Thus, it would be appropriate to begin our historical digression at the moment when Augustus became the first emperor of the Roman Empire. Let's assume that one day a group of Romans, Greeks, and Berbers was returning from several weeks of exploring the Canary Islands to trade with their inhabitants. This group, consisting of 500 people divided into 3 flotillas, found themselves trapped in a giant storm that violently shook the ocean, depriving them of the ability to navigate in optimal conditions. They completely lost control of their fleets and were swept away in the opposite direction. When the giant storm calmed and the waters of the Atlantic settled, 3 fleets were completely lost in the middle of the ocean. Without compasses, relying only on the stars, the sailors had no choice but to continue moving to the far west, believing that returning to Africa and the Mediterranean would be too dangerous. They decided to move forward, hoping to reach the shores of a distant Asian empire, of which there were rumors and tales. But after many weeks of extremely dangerous and hostile travel, during which many sailors had already died from disease or dehydration, 3 flotillas that somehow managed to stay in touch and remain together finally reached land. However, contrary to their expectations, the sailors did not land on the lands of a great and advanced Asian civilization, rivaling the Roman Empire in grandeur and sophistication, but found themselves on tropical and humid lands devoid of any signs of civilization or urbanization. Unbeknownst to them, these Greco-Roman Berber sailors discovered America by landing on the island of Cuba more than 1,500 years before the Spaniards in our timeline. After they thoroughly explored the island and interacted with its inhabitants, primarily the people known as Sibun, they managed to exchange goods with these primitive people with great difficulty. They tried to convey to the sailors that the island was actually just a tiny part of a giant continent located further west of Cuba, where the most developed peoples and civilizations of that time lived, if they could even be called that. Of course, the sailors, intrigued by this information and in need of new resources and supplies before heading back out to sea, decided to move further west across the waters of the bay they were in, ultimately reaching the eastern shore of the vast American continent, landing on a shore inhabited by the ancestors of what we now know as the Maya. At that time, they were not yet the great urbanized and centralized civilizations they would eventually become, but rather primitive peoples made up of many small, mostly autonomous villages. Nevertheless, the sailors soon found a people advanced enough for trade and the exchange of necessary resources for their long-awaited return to the Old World. Interaction with the Mayans was complicated due to the language barrier, but they showed no hostility or aggression. Pagan Romans were much more tolerant and indifferent, especially to cultural and religious differences. Yet they considered themselves the most advanced civilization in the world, surpassing all others. However, they did not arrive in America with colonial intentions and did not seek to forcibly convert the locals to their religion. As among the sailors, there were certainly those who practiced different cults, especially Berbers. After several weeks of peaceful life among the Mayans, trading goods and exploring these new lands, and after finally repairing their ships and replenishing all necessary supplies for the dangerous crossing of the Atlantic Ocean to return home, the Greco-Roman Berber sailors finally began their journey. They did not suspect that they were leaving behind many diseases for which the bodies of the indigenous peoples of America were unprepared, which became a devastating blow to all their nations. As we know, I think the return of the sailors will be much more difficult than the previous one, with huge losses and casualties, leading to a terrible state for the crews, many of whom will die from diseases and dehydration, exposed to ailments they brought from the New World, although not as severely as those diseases they left for the Native Americans. However, I find it hard to believe that during the time spent among the Native Americans, none of them formed close relationships with local women, risking the possibility that some might have brought diseases like syphilis to the Old World centuries before its appearance in Europe. This could have enormous consequences for the Roman Empire in terms of epidemics if any of them had intimate relations with the locals upon returning home. By the time they returned, only 100 of the original 500 sailors had survived the horrific journey that began as an accident. However, the survivors undoubtedly possessed a wealth of information and riches to bring to the higher authorities of the Roman Empire. Upon arrival, the sailors will do everything possible to gain the greatest privilege, the opportunity to meet Emperor Augustus and tell him about all their experiences during this tumultuous journey to unexplored lands. After several weeks of additional travel to Rome, along with many papers and organizational matters for the meeting with the emperor, a privilege unmatched for the merchant class, the meeting will finally take place. The emperor will be charmed and entertained by the sailors' tales, although he will doubt the truthfulness of their words. Fortunately, they will have plenty of evidence to confirm that their words are at least partially true. From their long journey, the sailors brought back many items, goods, clothing, and, importantly, unique products from distant lands they discovered. What products could they have brought from that part of America they explored? First of all, and most importantly, corn. A versatile, easily stored, and adaptable crop that could significantly impact nutrition in the Mediterranean. They could also bring products or ingredients such as chili peppers, avocados, beans, and of course tomatoes and chocolate. Two ingredients that would become fundamental to the Italian cuisine of the descendants of the Romans many centuries later. What about potatoes? No, they did not yet know about potatoes because by the 1st century BC, potatoes were only cultivated by many peoples of South America who would one day become known as the Incas, but not the Maya in Central America, and thus sailors could not bring this ingredient to the Old World. In any case, the expedition to these new lands, despite its randomness, would bring huge consequences, but also benefits for the Roman Empire. With the introduction of new vegetables and legumes, if properly adapted and cultivated in suitable regions of the empire, they could change and even revolutionize the Roman diet and nutrition. Although potatoes are not yet available, corn could be a great start for a mass-produced and easy-to-grow crop that could significantly better feed the poorest inhabitants of the empire. This would accelerate and simplify Augustus's desire to increase the population of the Roman Empire as much as possible. In this alternative reality, he would partially achieve this goal thanks to new products. In the next few years, I don't think there will be new expeditions to America, simply because of how dangerous and expensive that journey was, as well as the fact that there was still much to do in the known world. Nevertheless, August will invest significant resources in research and innovation in marine technologies to improve ships for ocean voyages in the future. Products imported from America will gradually become very popular, especially corn and beans, which will become staples in the diet of the poorest segments of the empire. They are easy to produce and will be accessible to most residents. These products will improve the quality of life for the poorest population of the empire and, consequently, significantly increased the population over the decades. Due to the population growth and consequently the increase in the number of soldiers in the Roman army, in this reality, thanks to the huge advantage that products like beans gave to Roman soldiers, they, despite great difficulties, losses, and betrayals from supposed allies, will ultimately be able to conquer Germany, or at least part of it, by the end of Augustus's reign. This will lead to more stable borders, a significant increase in population, and consequently, productivity in all necessary areas to support a complex structure like Roman society. During the remainder of the 1st century AD, the Romans would again focus on gathering information about those distant lands that provided them with so many blessings in the form of imported goods. However, it is also worth noting that some sailors brought with them a terrible sexually transmitted infection that inflicted irreparable damage on the Roman world, especially among prostitutes and slaves. Tiberius, seeking to legitimize his rule and reputation, takes on the immense responsibility of Augustus's succession, although he initially did not want to, likely to renew expeditions to America. This time it will be a completely purposeful journey, massively funded by the emperor, sending several flotillas consisting of thousands of people and an entire Roman legion to study in more detail the vast piece of land that sailors had spoken of decades ago. Ships have significantly improved and modernized over the last few decades, increasingly resembling Spanish caravels from the late 15th century of our reality. But to the surprise of thousands of men, when they arrived at the shores where the first explorers once landed, they found the place to be largely deserted. Many villages were completely abandoned and in ruins, creating an almost apocalyptic impression on these barbarians. Amazed by what might have happened, the Romans delved into these lands in search of answers about the mass depopulation of these areas, asking local inhabitants who possessed only scraps of information in a language based on the tales and records of the explorers. Eventually, they learned that decades ago, shortly after the sailors left these lands, a terrible plague descended upon the region, decimating the population of Central America. Without the infrastructure and urbanization that these people would experience centuries later, they would not have recovered from this terrible disaster, and the population no longer increased. Although it was sad, and the Romans were particularly cautious due to the fear of catching a disease, they could not resist the temptation to conquer part of these lands. Considering that this part of the continent was almost uninhabited, the Romans would have a completely free path for colonization and permanent settlement there. Ultimately, they decided that the Yucatan Peninsula would become part of the first Roman colony in America. Thus, thousands of men who embarked on this adventure decided to settle in these new lands and begin the process of urbanization and civilization in this part of the world over the next few years. While some of them returned to the Old World to report on the situation, the rest of the fleets and the entire legion accompanying them will begin the process of urbanization and Roman integration of the region. Over the following months and years, equipped with improved organization, weapons, armor, and a fleet, the Romans effortlessly conquered the indigenous population of the Caribbean islands, and most agreed to become part of Roman control, as these were still relatively unpopulated territories. This led to the creation of a direct trade route with the Old World and the founding of many coastal cities that served maritime navigation and trade in the following centuries. Throughout the 1st and 2nd centuries AD, Rome developed its trade routes with them, continuing to explore this vast continent from north to south, although they maintained a specific presence only in Central America. Although some trade connections with local inhabitants could have been interesting and quite profitable for the Romans due to the resources and wealth of certain areas, trade was very limited at first, and this lasted for several decades, as wherever the Romans appeared, they left behind many diseases and epidemics, which again depopulated the American continent. For a long time, the profitability of these colonies was mainly based on resource production and agricultural exports. When the Romans began interacting with the peoples of South America who had domesticated potatoes, they were able to start exporting it back to the Old World, revolutionizing and completely changing the diet and demographic prospects among the lower classes of the empire. However, not everything was perfect. Constant interaction with America brought many diseases and epidemics to the Old World, which also affected economic and demographic development in some parts of the empire, although to a lesser extent than the epidemics faced by the indigenous peoples of America. Ironically, the Romans became accustomed to these ailments, and their bodies largely developed immunity to them over decades, which overall contributed to improved health and quality of life due to excellent nutrition provided by such products as beans, corn, and potatoes. An interesting fact: likely due to the acceptance of the tomato and the proper understanding of its use and preparation. The Romans could have invented dishes resembling pizza almost 2,000 years ago. In this alternative scenario, Rome becomes the world's center of trade. Now, it was China that sought to establish trade with Rome to acquire all the wealth and exotic products possessed by the Romans, while Parthia did everything possible to disrupt and destabilize the trade routes between the two great powers. By the time of Trajan's reign, the population of Rome had grown enormously due to the introduction of corn and later potatoes, tripling the empire's population compared to our history, reaching approximately 200 million.